The moment Jesus spoke about money, people stopped listening politely and started feeling uncomfortable, because he did not speak about wealth as a blessing, nor poverty as an accident. He spoke about money as a test, a weapon, and a mirror of power. Jesus did not grow up in a world of opportunity and choice. He grew up surrounded by debt, taxation, and quiet desperation. And before he ever spoke of heaven, he understood exactly how earth was controlled. When Jesus talked about debt, people leaned closer. And when he talked about wealth, people felt exposed. Because his words were not abstract theologies, they were descriptions of daily survival. This was not a dystopian future. This was daily life in the time of Jesus of Nazareth, in a land whose people were no longer free, in a society tightly bound by invisible chains of money, obligation, and social hierarchy. We often imagine the ancient world as simple, small villages, honest labor, basic trade, and barter, but the economy of first-century Judea was anything but simple. It was layered, calculated, and deliberately unequal. A system designed not just to produce wealth, but to extract it from the many and concentrate it in the hands of the few. This was an economy so sophisticated that ordinary people barely recognized it as a system. They only felt its effects in empty granaries, unpaid debts, and a constant pressure to survive. Jesus was born into a land that no longer belonged to its people. Judea was under Roman occupation, not only by soldiers, but by systems that governed every aspect of daily life. Rome understood a fundamental truth about power. If you control land, taxes, and money, you do not need constant violence people who will discipline themselves. The empire's authority became internalized, making oppression invisible yet deeply effective. At the top of this structure sat the Roman emperor, more than a ruler, presented as a symbol of divine order, whose image was stamped on coins reminding everyone who truly owned value and whose favor decided the flow of wealth and survival. Below him were governors like Pontius Pilate, whose mission was simple: maintain order, collect taxes, and send wealth back to Rome. Their success was measured not in justice, not in lives saved or families protected, but in the amount of silver shipped across the empire. Rome did not ask whether people were hungry. Rome asked whether they paid. The economy of Judea rested almost entirely on agriculture, and the majority of people were peasants who lived from harvest to harvest. Their survival depended on unpredictable weather, soil, fertility, and timing. One failed harvest could erase the security of an entire family for generations. Yet this fragile life was burdened by a rigid web of obligations that reached into every corner of existence. There was no single currency. Different authorities demanded different forms of money. Roman coins were required for imperial taxes. Greek coins dominated trade, and temple coins were required for religious duties. Every family had to navigate a daily ritual of payments that functioned like a carefully choreographed extraction process. First, a portion of their harvest or earnings was handed to the Roman tax collector, counted, weighed, and documented, flowing directly to the empire. Then, they sent part of their remaining produce or money to the regional ruler, like Herod Antipas, who demanded his share for local administration and military security. Finally, after surviving these two extractions, the family faced the temple tax. They had to exchange their remaining coins for the official temple currency at the tables of the money changers, paying fees and losing more value along the way. Each step drained them further, and by the time they returned home, the fruits of their labor had been halved or more. Every act of survival was intertwined with this economic choreography of extraction, a constant reminder that their work, harvest, and even faith carried a cost. This is why Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple was not just a symbolic act. It was a direct confrontation with a system designed to exploit every single transaction. Taxes, fees, and mandatory exchanges were structured not to facilitate order but to maintain control, keeping ordinary people under constant financial pressure. Taxes formed the backbone of this control, and a single peasant family did not face just one levy, but multiple layers. The Roman tribute tax sent to the empire, the regional tax under rulers like Herod Antipas, and the temple tax framed as obedience to God. Combined, these could consume nearly half of a family's annual production. If the harvest was good, survival was barely possible. If it failed, debt followed immediately. Debt was the true weapon of the system. There were no banks, as we know them, but there were lenders. Wealthy elites lent grain, silver, or other necessities to struggling farmers. Interest accumulated quietly, often hidden in repayment terms that made it nearly impossible to escape. Debt did not forgive drought, flood, or disease. When farmers could not repay, land became collateral. Missed one season, and ownership weakened. Miss another, and land was lost entirely. Families who had cultivated the same fields for generations became tenants on their own land. Others became day laborers, hired when needed and discarded when not. Debt was not temporary. It was displacement, a system that perpetuated dependence and crushed any hope of autonomy. This is why Jesus' parables were filled with landlords, debtors, and wages. These were not abstract moral lessons. They were mirrors of reality, teaching the people to see the invisible chains that bound them. When he spoke of forgiving debts, listeners understood immediately what that would mean. Loss of land, loss of status, loss of a future carefully built over generations. The unforgiving servant was not just morally flawed. He represented the system itself, which crushed mercy in favor of profit, efficiency, and social hierarchy. As land concentrated, a new class emerged. Large estate owners who rarely touched the soil they profited from, living in cities far removed from hunger. And while managers enforced quotas, laborers received barely enough wages to survive. Productivity rose, but security vanished. Rome celebrated stability. The elites called it efficiency. And for the poor, it felt like slow. Religion, which could have acted as a counterweight, often reinforced the system. The temple demanded offerings regardless of circumstance. And failure meant social exclusion, spiritual shame, and moral condemnation. Over time, poverty was redefined not as structural injustice, but as personal failure. Wealth became associated with righteousness, poverty with sin, and the moral order of society became inverted. This is what made Jesus' words so dangerous. When he said the poor were blessed, he challenged the very logic of society. When he warned that wealth endangered the soul, he exposed not personal failings, but systemic exploitation. In that economy, accumulation rarely existed without extraction. To rise, someone else had to fall. Pressure built in every village and every home. Tax resistance increased. Banditry spread, messianic hopes intensified. People were not only waiting for spiritual salvation, they were desperate for economic relief. Rome responded with fear, and when fear failed, with blood. Crucifixion was not merely execution. It was a calculated public spectacle, a warning to anyone who challenged the status quo. Jesus was not crucified only for kindness. He was crucified for speaking of a kingdom that reversed power. A kingdom where debts were forgiven, where the last became first. After his death, the economic structure remained intact. Charity replaced justice. Alms softened suffering without changing the underlying causes. Debt endured. Land concentration increased. Power stayed centralized. The system survived. And yet, history echoes in ways we often ignore. Look at the modern world. Most people live to service debt. Homes grow less affordable relative to wages. Money is created far from ordinary people, and its benefits flow upward first. Taxes burden labor more heavily than capital. Debt no longer requires chains or overseers. It operates through contracts, interest rates, and legal frameworks. The tools are modern, but the logic is ancient. Economic systems always carry moral consequences. Debt has always been the most efficient form of control. Jesus was not rejecting wealth itself. He was rejecting systems built on exploitation. Civilizations do not collapse when money disappears. They collapse when money forgets humanity. Rome learned this too late. The question is not whether history repeats itself. The question is whether we recognize the pattern while living inside it. Because the economy of the time of Jesus was not primitive. It was precise, designed, and once you truly see it, you cannot unsee it.